Thanks very much, Jimmy, and thanks, Anna, too, for your presentation. And I have to say that the two environment centres here are doing fantastic work with shoestring resources. And really, you need to throw all your energy and resources behind them, because without them, it would be really even more difficult by a long shot. So I'm going to talk about sustainable energy for Australia, and by sustainable, I mean ecologically sustainable. Now, while I think of it, if people want to see the slides, there's plenty of seats down the front. Feel free to come down because otherwise the whole talk is based around the slideshow. Okay. So we start with Earth seen from space. Just the obvious reminder that we have only this planet. It's the only habitable planet in our solar system for human beings, at least for the foreseeable future. And it is really in a very fragile state thanks to the actions of us human beings. And one of the main impacts, really severe impacts on the planet, is the use of fossil fuels, coal, oil and gas. Burning them produces greenhouse gas emissions, as Anna has said, and although Australia, and particularly this part of Australia, has always had droughts and occasional floods and heat waves and fires, the science is now showing that the frequency of these events, particularly of heat waves, has increased substantially in recent decades. So we're already in global climate change. We're already feeling it, and if nothing's done, it's going to get worse. So climate change is our number one concern, but fossil fuels have a whole range of other impacts as well. They produce pollution of the air and the water and the land. Pretty hard to read. They actually, despite all the hype, they produce very few jobs. If you go to a big coal-fired power station, I guess you won't see one of those in the Territory, the first thing that strikes you is there's nobody there. Apart from the people guiding the tours, they're giant, outside the station you'll see giant dredges imported from overseas, mining the coal, putting it onto conveyor belts without human hand touching it, trundling the coal into the power stations where it goes into the boilers, into the furnaces, and really the only staff you'll see at the power station, apart from the guides, are a few people in the control room. And coal mining too has become highly capital intensive. So in the whole, with the huge multi-billion coal mining exercise in Australia, there's only 50,000 people employed, and 80% of that coal is exported. So you could say that there's only 10,000 people employed basically for the domestic uses of coal. Now, in 2012, there were 24,000 people employed in Australia in renewable energy. That's direct employment already, because renewable energy lends itself, it's smaller scale, it lends itself for local manufacture and installation and sales, and really if we want jobs, renewable energy and energy efficiency are the ways to go. And yet certain politicians, they talk about coal jobs as if they really cared, when there's far more jobs available in renewable energy. Now, I don't know if you can see this. This is basically saying that we're now in a position we can choose. We can choose between fossil fuels, in the left of that picture, the old fossil fuel dinosaurs, and renewable energy on the right-hand side. Unfortunately, there's still a few people in positions of power, some of our politicians, the Murdoch press, the Australian Financial Review, that, that are fossil fuels, so attached to fossil fuels that they cannot see the opportunities for creating a better world based on ecologically sustainable energy systems. And ecologically sustainable energy systems have two components. Renewable energy is obviously one of the components, but the other component is at least equally important, perhaps more important, and that is reducing the demand for wasteful uses of energy through efficient energy use, which means getting the same energy services but while using less energy. Energy conservation, which means reducing unnecessary energy services. So if it's a bit cool in the evening, wearing a jumper instead of turning up the heaters. And more recently, there are opportunities, particularly in the electricity sector, for modifying demand at certain critical periods without causing disruptions to us, to the customers. And this is demand reduction in a so-called smart electricity system. So there are those three ways of reducing energy wastage. And then with renewable energy, we have wind, sunshine, two principal types of solar energy converter. We have, not in the NT, but we have hydro. And, well, I'll show you some pictures if you can see them. So this is a kind of a selection of some of the sustainable energy sources. On the left is a housing development in Adelaide called Christie Walk, which is highly energy efficient. It has solar. It's a cooperatively owned housing development in the heart of Adelaide. It's fantastic. There aren't enough of these developments. And this picture really goes through just showing you some of the ways you can save energy simply by being more efficient. And so obviously I'm sure you all have water efficient shower heads. Not only does that save water, but it saves hot water, and so that saves energy as well. Ceiling fans can be very effective, particularly in this dry climate. They're not so effective in places like Darwin, where you've got a wet tropical climate. There's a heat pump hot water system which you can run. So it's an electric system that pumps heat out of the environment into the water tank. And basically, the most efficient ones now will give you 4.5 kilowatt hours of heat for every kilowatt hour of electricity used to pump the heat. It's not violating the conservation of energy. It's basically a refrigerator in reverse. LED lights, and there's a whole range of ways you can become more efficient in your use of energy. And that's the first step. And then the next step is to see to what extent you can supply the remaining energy with renewable sources. Now, that's a solar map of Australia, and the redder it gets, the more sunshine you have. And lo and behold, Northern Territory is the reddest of the lot. It has huge solar potential, and particularly this region, where the air is dry, you have potential not only for solar photovoltaics, which are the usual ones you see on your rooftop, but you also, because the air is so clear, you can concentrate the sunlight. You can have what's called concentrated solar thermal power. And that's currently not as mass-produced as PV, so it is still quite expensive. But as the market grows, its cost will come down, just like PV. And here's another map, also from Geoscience Australia. And this is showing the resource of hot rocks under the ground. And again, the redder the colour, the higher the temperature of the rocks underground. And again, you'll see in the territory there a very red spot that deserves further exploration, because if the rocks are hot enough under the ground, you can generate electricity from them by drilling a couple of wells, pumping water down one well and catching the steam that comes up the other to turn a turbine and generate electricity. Now, this is not a commercial technology yet. It has been demonstrated on a very tiny scale in Australia and France and Germany, but it could become very big in the future. Okay, so let's talk about solar photovoltaics, solar PV. And solar PV is so flexible. Well, for a start, it has no moving parts apart from the electrons in the wires. It can be built on a very small scale, and I don't know if you can see the picture there on the far left, but it's in Bangladesh or India, a very tiny solar module, just enough to power a LED light. But that system is starting to transform the third world, because it means with good lighting that is economical, it's cheaper than in many places than having an awful kerosene lamp. In many places, it means kids can do homework, the whole community in the village can improve its education and improve their whole economy and society. So going from a module about that size in that tiny thing right up to, at the bottom of the picture is a new 100 megawatt solar power station at Nyngan in New South Wales. Now you wouldn't be able to use such a big solar power station near the Alice, but somewhere in between, you've got a picture of Uterne, which I was fortunate to see when I came from the airport, and we're starting to see solar being rolled out in the Alice, starting of course with Alice Springs, as it was one of the original solar cities. But now what we really need to talk about is phase 2, making it a solar city on a much bigger scale than just on an initial exciting but very much nominal scale. Okay, now you have a picture of concentrated solar thermal power. What you see there is thousands of mirrors focused on a central tower, and that aerial picture makes everything look rather small, but the tower at the centre is 140 metres high, and this is in Portugal. It's a 20 megawatt power station. 20,000 kilowatts is its rated power or maximum power. And at the foot of that tower, those in the front might just be able to see there's 2 silos at the foot of the tower, and they contain molten salts. And if you have a sunny daytime, part of the heat from the sun goes to generate electricity immediately by producing steam, but the other part of the heat can be stored in these tanks of molten salt. And then at night time, that heat can be released to generate electricity through the night. And in summer, this power station, which is called Gemma Solar, is generating 24 hours a day. It will not generate if you have clouds, because it focuses direct sunlight. While photovoltaics, on the other hand, with flat plate collectors, can still generate even if you have clouds, although it won't be generating at full power. In fact, some flat plate PV systems will generate when the full moon is shining. So they will generate a little bit during the night, but only about 1% of their rated power. Okay, well, now our research at the University of New South Wales has been on how we could run the whole of Australia's electricity supply on renewable energy. And basically we have to remember that we don't just use energy as electricity. We also use it as transport. And at present, of course, transport is mostly based on oil. And we also have a lot of heat that we need for industry and even for residential heating in the winter, where the heat is often produced by burning gas or even coal for some of the industries. So what I'm going to say is that for electricity, it now looks feasible to generate all or nearly all of our electricity over the next few decades, making that transition from renewable sources. Transport is a little more difficult. We can have electric transport and active transport in our towns and cities, but obviously if you're going to drive out into the wilds, you won't have batteries that can take you far enough yet. And the only option for long-distance rural transport at present that's renewable would be using biofuels. And there are some problems there. The other area where we don't have a solution yet for in transport is, of course, air transport. You can't directly power an aircraft by electricity, except for the fantastic solar plane that is attempting to fly around the world purely on solar power and batteries, but that has only, it can't carry a heavy weight. It couldn't carry hundreds of passengers. It's carrying one pilot. So for air transport, you'd be looking at using renewable energy to produce a fuel like nitrogen, like hydrogen or ammonia that could be then combusted. For non-electrical heat, a lot of that can be replaced either by direct solar at low temperatures, solar heating and cooling, or by electric heat pumps. And as I've said, they're highly efficient. So it's looking good, and I'm going to look in a bit more detail in a moment. Now, I'll start by telling you a little bit about our research at the University of New South Wales, which is on the large scale. So we're looking at the whole national electricity market. And the reason I'm starting with that is not simply because of ego, hubris on behalf of the UNSW, but because it's actually easier to run the whole system, this whole national electricity market, so-called, which is really the eastern and southern Australian system that's joined together by transmission lines. It's easier to run that large scale on 100%, and we could make that transition now over about 15, 20 years. It's easier than trying to run the whole of Alice Springs off 100% renewables. So I'll try and explain why. Okay, so this is just a picture of the great diversity of renewable energy sources that we have in Australia, but not necessarily all of them in the territory. So we have concentrated solar thermal potential, but, and that has huge potential in the territory, but not so much around Darwin, where it tends to be more wet tropical, and the atmosphere is more full of moisture, so you don't get so much direct sunlight as you do here. Solar PV, of course. Wind power, it can be huge in southern Australia, but doesn't seem to be much wind in the territory. Geothermal, I've already mentioned. There could be a lot of hot rocks available in the future to generate near Darwin with hot rocks. Tidal current power is something that is being looked at currently at the Charles Darwin University in cooperation with a company, because just off the coast near Darwin there is a place called the Clarence Strait where the tidal currents are running through very strongly. So there's potential to put a turbine under the water there and generate. So that's quite interesting. Wave power, well, you won't see a lot of that around here, but there is a wave power plant operating near Fremantle in Western Australia and another one in Victoria. These are demonstration plants, so they're not yet ready for commercial mass production. But the point I want to make is, if we look at Australia as a whole, we've got the lot. We've got everything except only modest hydroelectricity resources because of our low rainfall. But otherwise, we've got the lot. We are so blessed with renewable energy. Okay, so now I'll just tell you a little about some of the research we're doing at UNSW on the so-called national electricity market. And the market is the yellow region of Australia there. The eastern and southern states, they're all joined together by transmission lines. And yeah, they're given this false name, the national electricity market, which is pretty hard on the territory in WA. But anyway, that's what political power does for you, I suppose. So what we've been doing is running computer simulations. Now, before you switch off, I should say this is really very simple stuff. What we do is we collect data every hour on the actual electricity demand over the whole of the national electricity market, and also on the sunshine and wind over the whole region. We've got that data all over the region. And then what we try to do every hour is to supply 100%, if we can, of the demand every hour. And initially we did that for a whole year, the year 2010, and now we're doing it for 8 years. So we've got 8 years of real data, and each hour we try to balance supply from renewables with the actual demand. Because one of the criticisms that's made of renewable energy is, oh, it's not reliable, it's intermittent, it's variable. You can't possibly run an industrial society on renewable energy. You've all heard that kind of stuff. It doesn't produce baseload power. All that. Well, all of that is either wrong or grossly misleading, as we've discovered. And I need to say here that part of our successful learning process in this research has been thanks to a PhD student, Ben Elliston, who's a computer whiz and who designed the computer program that allowed us to run through a whole year of hourly data in half a second. And knowing that we can do that, it means we can do hundreds or thousands of runs in a very short period, changing the mixture of renewable energy sources, changing our operating strategies for the whole system, and find out what's the best way to do it. And furthermore, we've got costs of all the technologies and fuels, in the case of fossil fuels, projected by the Australian government to 2030. So we took their cost figures, even though we think they have exaggerated the future costs of renewable energy. In fact, we know they have, because these figures were first generated in 2012, and their projected costs for solar PV electricity in 2030 were reached last year. Okay? And the other thing is, we think they've been very optimistic about fossil fuels because they've assumed that gas prices in 2030 will be the same as in 2012. Well, in Eastern Australia, where I come from, gas prices have been going up like that, mainly because Queensland is starting to export gas, and soon New South Wales, unfortunately, might be tied into that. So the result is that the exporters can get maybe 3 times the price for gas than they can get from selling it within Australia. So that's dragging up the prices in Eastern Australia. Now, the gas situation is probably quite different here in the Territory, where I think you have what's called a take or pay contract, which may keep the prices more stable. Okay, so that's what we did, and I'll show you some of the results quickly. Okay, so what you see there is a week of supply and demand in winter in the national electricity market. So this is electricity supply and demand, and every day has got a double peak. So this day has a peak at breakfast time and a peak at dinner time. So you can sort of see, and the different colours are the different renewable energy sources. So wind is green, solar PV is the dark purple, concentrated solar thermal with thermal storage is the yellow, and the pale blue is hydro. So you've got this mixture of sources, and this is one of the worst weeks we have ever had, because you can see over here the green wind was very low for the first 2 days in this week, and the sun wasn't that great either. So we had to fill in the gaps with a gap filler. And our gap filler is the cheapest gap filler technology that is potentially renewable that we could get. So batteries are still much too expensive. So don't shudder. We filled in those gaps with gas turbines, but they're not burning fossil gas. They're burning renewable gases or liquids. A gas turbine is just like a jet engine, and you've seen the aircraft start. They can start from cold to full power in about 10 minutes. It's a very flexible source. You can go up and down with a gas turbine, very flexible, and it'll burn almost anything. It'll burn biofuels like ethanol and methanol and biodiesel. It'll burn the fossil fuels, of course. And they are. Some of the jet flights that Qantas and Virgin are flying at present are running one engine partly or totally on biodiesel. They don't tell the passengers, but they're doing it because they know that at present their only alternative to fossil fuels is biofuels. So in our model, there are a few periods of the year, particularly on a winter evening after an overcast day, when the wind and the sun together aren't enough, and so we turn on the gas turbines. They're very cheap technology because the jet engines are mass-produced. They're cheap if you don't have to fly from Darwin to London or something. But if you're only using them occasionally, they don't use much fuel at all. So that's our gap filler. Now, let me show you what happens when we put the costs on. So we get a pie diagram, and that's the pie showing the share of annual electricity production according to which source. And what you can see there is that wind, averaged over the year, supplied 46% of the electricity of the national electricity market. Solar PV supplied 20%. So now these are the two variable renewable sources. They fluctuate like crazy, day and night, clouds crossing the sun, and of course wind fluctuating. But 2/3 of that annual electricity is coming from variable or so-called intermittent sources. But this is a reliable system. This is meeting the reliability criterion of the national electricity market. So how's that possible with all that variable source in there, the two of them? Well, it's possible because the variations in wind and solar PV are balanced by the other sources, which is concentrated solar thermal power, which has thermal storage in the molten salt tanks, the existing hydro system, and gas turbines filling in the rest. So it's that combination of variable renewable sources and flexible, we call them dispatchable, reliable renewable energy sources that produces a reliable system. So you can see why I started with the large-scale system, because we've got all these different sources. It makes it much easier to balance the books, to balance supply and demand almost every hour. But it isn't just having the mixture of the variable sources and the flexible dispatchable sources. Another thing is that over the national electricity market, we can spread out the wind farms and solar power stations. So if the wind isn't blowing in one region, it's almost certainly blowing somewhere else. And that means the fluctuations become much less. If you're just trying to supply an isolated town or city like Alice Springs, you can't rely on such wide geographic distribution. So it's more challenging. So that's why I'll come to the suggestion that you initially aim for 50% renewable electricity in the Alice and not initially aim for 100%. 100% will come later as batteries become cheaper and cheaper. Oh, and the other thing to say is, of course, you need a few key transmission line links, and we've recommended joining South Australia directly to New South Wales and Queensland. There's no direct link at present. It's only joined through to Victoria. And also we can have this smart demand management that I mentioned, that you can have a so-called smart electricity grid that if the demand is very high and the supply is low for a short period, you can switch off an aluminium smelter, or in your home you could switch off the fridge for half an hour. The food won't know the difference in half an hour. Obviously, if you switch it off for 3 hours, it will make a difference. You can switch off an air conditioner for half an hour. And in theory, you can roll that switching off at different times across the whole community. So we have the technology to do that now, but it hasn't been rolled out on a mass scale. Okay, so we now come to the Northern Territory. And for Alice, you don't have any wind, you don't have any tidal currents, but you have sunshine galore. So you can have solar PV, which you already have, and you can build on that. And in addition, as it becomes less expensive, you can have concentrated solar thermal power with thermal storage, which will smooth out some of the fluctuations in the solar PV power. In Darwin, well, there's hardly any solar in Darwin as yet, so there's huge potential for rooftop solar. There's also the possible future potential for geothermal power and for tidal current power. So with Darwin, it's going to take longer once you go beyond solar PV, but there's still huge potential for solar PV. And the barriers there seem to be barriers that should be easy to overcome if there is political will. So I've been told, for example, that because it's a cyclone region, you need special requirements to make sure solar collectors don't fly off the roofs during a cyclone, because they could be rather nasty missiles. And that can be quite expensive, over $1,000 just to have properly registered controlled cyclone protection. Okay, and although Darwin itself is probably not a good site for concentrated solar thermal, it is joined by transmission line to Katherine, which is further inland, where the air is somewhat clearer. So it may be possible in the future to build a concentrated solar thermal plant near Katherine and feed the power not only to Katherine but into Darwin. Okay, so what I'm showing you now is something you might say, well, why are you showing me wind turbines? This is all about providing medium-scale renewable energy for remote communities. And by a remote community, I mean one that's not connected to a large electricity network, like Alice Springs, for example, or Tennant Creek. Yeah, that's another one. So what you see there, on the top, you see the remotest of all communities, which is the Australian Antarctic base in Mawson. And it's powered by a combination of diesel and wind turbines. You can imagine how expensive it is to get diesel fuel to the Antarctic. So they calculated, when they did the economics of wind power there, that if the wind turbines survived for 1 year in the Antarctic environment, they would pay for themselves in terms of diesel fuel saved. Well, these wind turbines have lasted a lot longer than that. They're laughing. But we can come much closer to home to see successful remote communities powered essentially half and half by renewable energy and diesels. And we only have to go to Western Australia. And on the bottom right, you see one of the Western Australian towns which has a wind diesel system. It's called Hopetown. But there's, anyone been to Coral Bay? Yeah, near Ningaloo Reef. That's also a wind diesel system. And there are several others, Bremer Bay and so on. Now, originally those remote towns were powered only by diesels, and the diesel fuel is quite expensive. Not as expensive as in the Antarctic, but still very expensive compared with the cost in the city. So what they've done is, but they've had a problem, and that is that if you put diesel and wind together, a conventional diesel is not very flexible. A diesel engine, you can sort of, if the wind comes up, you need to ramp the diesel down in output, and a conventional diesel you can ramp down to about 40% of its rated power. And if you try and ramp it much further, you'll damage it or greatly increase the maintenance costs. So what the Western Australians have done, they've been very smart, and in fact they've had help from a Northern Territory company called Powercore in Darwin. They have modified the diesels in these towns to turn them into what they call low-load diesels, which means they can be ramped down to about 5% of their rated power without actually damaging them. And what you're seeing here is wind plus low-load diesels, and that wind is providing 40 to 50% of the annual electricity generation. And at certain times of the years, it provides nearly 100%. And that system works. It's been working for decades. So I was astonished to hear that the solar setup scheme is only aiming for a 15% contribution of solar to the diesel systems that exist in remote areas around the territory. I think that this needs to be looked at in more detail. Of course, you need a more sophisticated control system to operate diesels together with fluctuating wind or fluctuating solar. But it should be possible to get to 40 or 50% with small modifications. And certainly Powercore and some of the other companies in Australia have decades of experience in doing it. So that's very exciting. Okay, I better move more quickly. Okay, so what policies do we need? And Anna has stated some very important policies that you need in the territory. I'm just going to add a few more and go over it. But I'm going to have to move over here so I can actually read my own slideshow. Okay, so for a start, you need targets, serious targets. And Anna's already mentioned that. You need targets for energy efficiency. You need targets for renewable energy. You need not just renewable electricity, but maybe even renewable heating and cooling. You need legislation that gives people the right to feed electricity into the grid and get paid a fair price. I mean, what's happening in some of the other parts of Australia is foreshadowing what could happen here. In Queensland, some of the electricity utilities are refusing to accept solar electricity from their customers, and they can legally do that. They say, oh, it's too hard. We didn't design the power lines to take power in both directions. Well, stiff cheese. I mean, you know, they've seen the renewable energy revolution coming over the last decade, with solar PV prices dropping 80%, 90% in some cases. In Europe, in the countries that have been most successful have legislated to require the electricity retailers and distributors to accept solar power or wind power fed back into the grid. And in the case of Denmark, where communities projects was the basis of the fantastic renaissance of wind power in the world and the fantastic Danish export industry for wind turbines, they legislated the right to feed in and fair prices. I mean, where I live in Sydney, my electricity retailer pays $0 for solar power fed back into the grid. If you're lucky, you might get 6 cents a kilowatt hour or 8 cents, but you may be paying 25 or 30 cents or more per kilowatt hour for what you buy from the grid. You also should, if you have a big roof with lots of sunshine, you should have the right to put a power line across to your neighbour and sell it directly. Governments talk about the free market and the market for electricity, but it's tightly controlled. That's illegal at present to do it. The City of Sydney has tried for years. It has high-rise buildings in the city that use lots of electricity, and it has low-rise buildings with flat roofs that use almost no electricity, and all they want to do is feed power from their low-rise rooftops to their neighbouring high-rise buildings. It's illegal. They've tried for years and they've had to give up. So laws have to be changed. There needs to be some exploration of putting in solar PV well beyond 15%, not in the diesel communities, the communities powered by diesel, but also in Alice Springs and in Katherine, where you have gas turbines, open cycle gas turbines, very flexible. These are the jet engines, basically. There needs to be some exploration of putting in a lot of solar in combination with those gas turbines. For example, at Owen Springs, which is one of your main local power stations. There needs to be, I think, a concentrated solar thermal power station with thermal storage near Alice Springs. Now, at this stage, it's no way near being economically competitive, but the costs are coming down, and we still have an Australian Renewable Energy Agency that will provide grants for such projects. The federal government has been trying to shut the agency down, along with the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, but they haven't yet got the numbers in the Senate. So it's worth putting in a grant application to put in a concentrated solar thermal power station. That means you'll have storage, and that will make this whole solar system more reliable. And last but not least, the government needs to start providing seeding grants for community groups that want to establish community renewable energy, community solar projects. I have to say that's one of the really positive things that's happening in New South Wales is that the state government is providing these seeding grants. Okay, I better wrap up. Oh, that's just a picture of the Hepburn Wind Farm. It's the first community-owned medium-scale renewable energy project in Australia. 2 large wind turbines owned by a cooperative. And the members of the cooperative put in about $10 million. They also got a bank loan of $3 million, and the Victorian government at the time put in $1 million as well. Freiburg in Germany is a green city. It's covered with solar. It has wind turbines on the hills. It has superb public transport system based on trams. I mean, things are happening around the world, but they won't happen unless the people get up and say they want it to happen. We have a federal government at present that makes no secret that it wants to shut down renewable energy if it can. And although they finally negotiated a reduction in our renewable energy target, the Prime Minister has said on several occasions his preference would be to remove it entirely. Now, you know, the only thing that has stopped them removing or killing the small-scale renewable energy target has been pressure from the owners. We already have 1.4 million households in Australia that have solar on their roof, and they're starting to form a very strong force that can exercise lobbying pressure on governments, whether it's coalition or Labor, it makes no difference. That pressure needs to come. There's a group called Solar Citizens, which people who have solar on their roofs or would like to have solar can join, and that is exercising pressure. So we are talking about the need for a community movement. All the public opinion polls show that the vast majority of Australians support renewable energy, but our federal government and, I have to say, most of the state and territory governments, the ACT is an exception, are dragging their feet. So I think we will have a solar and a whole renewable energy future for Australia but it'll come a lot quicker with more public pressure. Thanks very much. And
Wow, that's very impressive. Are there questions? I'm sure there are some questions in the audience. I'll go to Rosalie first because she's closest.
Look, I'm really greedy and I've got two questions. The first one is, what's going to happen to some of these renewable sources with climate change? Obviously the snowy river is going to dry up. The wind might get more dangerous and stronger and destroy the wind turbines. And the other question is, with these solar, the gas, diesel where it needs to turn off and on, can't you just have a computer that say, oh, the wind's going to get bigger in half an hour, we can just ramp it down now, so you don't have to wait till it happens. You should be able to predict that. Likewise, solar, you know when the sun's going to go down, you don't need to wait for it to go down.
Well, answering the last one first, yes, certainly. And nowadays there is a lot of prediction done, particularly for wind farms. And the beauty is with a wind farm is that they spread out over kilometres or tens of kilometres. So even if when the wind does drop, it doesn't drop across the whole wind farm at the same time. So they go down slowly and then they come on slowly. So actually, and if you've got a whole network of wind farms over a large area, and the same thing applies to solar farms, then the fluctuations are less and they can be tracked. Now, what was the first question? Oh yeah, now climate change. Yes, climate change probably will have some impact on renewable energy, and it's really hard to predict, and that's the problem. So one possibility is that the stronger winds might move further south. I don't think it's going to have major effects on sunshine, except possibly in really tropical areas where there may be changes in the moisture and in fact in the monsoon in some parts of the world. So look, this is hard to predict, and I think all we can do is we can do a fair bit of computer modelling, but ultimately there'll be some uncertainty in that.
You appeared to promote the heat pump as an efficient way for heating water, yet there didn't seem to be equal sort of promotion for a solar system on a roof.
I guess I took it for granted because solar hot water has been with us, and certainly solar hot water is fine. One of its great advantages over the heat pump is that it's a much simpler system, and so it should need less maintenance. Well, for my sins, I have invested in the most efficient heat pump system, which I'm going to drive with PV, and there are a few teething issues. It took me a while to work out how to make certain adjustments on it, but I think, there's possibilities both ways. The advantage of the heat pump is for people who don't have solar on their roofs. The heat pump does not need direct sunshine. It picks up heat from the environment around it, and so there's room for both technologies.
Just to follow on from that one, how does the heat pump compare in cost and efficiency and carbon emissions to an instantaneous gas system?
Well, a heat pump driven by solar PV will have negligible emissions. I guess that's the first thing. In terms of cost, heat pumps are quite expensive. It's the installation that's expensive because you need an electrician and a plumber, and I'm not quite sure with solar hot water whether one person can do it. So you basically need two people to do the installation. But highly efficient heat pumps are just coming onto the market. And like any other technology that has many qualities, their cost is going to come down quite substantially.
Okay, and can I just ask about the 50% Alice Springs energy? Surely we've got enough solar to supply power to the whole town with all the sun we have.
No, the problem is handling the fluctuations. So batteries are still very expensive, although they're starting to come down with some of the big corporations like Tesla building gigantic lithium-ion battery factories. But right now, if you're connected to the grid, it would cost a fortune in batteries to disconnect from the grid. I think what's going to happen first is that people with solar will put in a small amount of battery so that if they're out during the daytime and their home is collecting solar energy but is not using any electricity apart from the fridge, they'll be able to meet their evening peak in demand from the batteries. I think that's how, at a residential level, the batteries will start. And they are starting. But because at this stage there's not a lot of competition, there's not many companies that are supplying an integrated system of solar and batteries and inverters and controllers. You need a fairly sophisticated control system with batteries if you're going to catch as much of the solar energy as possible and use it, rather than just feeding it into the grid and being paid almost nothing for it. Of course, you're still getting a very generous feed-in tariff in the territory, but as soon as solar grows, what will happen here is what's happened in the other parts of Australia. They'll drop the feed-in tariffs dramatically, and that's the worry. So right now, it really makes sense to put solar PV on your roof. You're getting paid essentially what you pay for electricity from the grid. In most of the other states, you're only getting a tiny fraction or zero.
I was one of the integral shareholders in Geodynamics.
Mm-hmm.
Now there they have 26,000 years of energy at current runs of consumption, but it's just not happening. Now when I put that to a very successful investment banker in Sydney and said, what do we do about this? He said, well, you show me a rate of return that's acceptable and I'll find you money to upgrade it. And that's a major problem. The other small problem was with, not a problem, and it's actually an excellent thing. You mentioned the Christie's Close in Adelaide. I have friends there, and they claim that real estate rates and prices in that area have gone through the roof because of Christie's Close. And that's a lesson that the developers and real estate industry here should take on board very quickly.
Yeah, the problem is that with hot rock geothermal power, you have a huge capital cost. You've got to drill these 2 wells down maybe 5 kilometres, and you've got to use a wider drill than the one used for drilling for oil. So this is a very expensive, risky operation. The first time Geodynamics drilled a well, the drill bit broke off 2.5 kilometres or 3 kilometres down, and they couldn't move it, and they had to just start again with another well. It's not easy, and I think people at the beginning thought it would be easier than it's turned out to be. Now, I think in the long run it could still be successful, but compared with solar and wind, you've got a much bigger unit investment in this big drilling operation. Well, to develop a better solar cell or a wind turbine, your unit costs are much smaller for that technology. So that's why I think it's been much slower to come on board. But certainly there's interest overseas, there's interest in the United States, and I think in the long run it'll appear and become commercial, but not soon.
Does the transmission of electricity over vast distances represent the Achilles heel in terms of the national energy market efficiencies? And is it viable at the moment to produce hydrogen by using solar power and water?
Okay, the energy losses in transmission are not as great as most people imagine. So in Australia, the losses, very roughly, the losses in the whole transmission and local distribution system is about 10% of the electricity. But most of those losses occur locally with the low voltage local lines that run along your streets. That's where the big losses actually occur. For long distance, what they do is they have very high voltage. So you get these huge towers and the losses are relatively low. And if you go very long distances, you can transmit the power in direct current rather than alternating current, which is the usual form of electricity that we deal with in our towns. And direct current has much less losses as well. Now, of course, if we're talking about transmitting electricity solar electricity produced on a huge scale in Central Australia to Asia by transmission line under the sea. There you are talking about a huge project which may be possible in the long-term future, but the capital costs are enormous and the losses will be significant, even with direct current power lines. Your other question about hydrogen, yes, technically we can produce hydrogen now from renewable energy. And in fact, in the 1890s, a Danish school teacher set up a system in his school where he had a small wind turbine and he used the electricity produced to split through electrolysis to split water into hydrogen and oxygen, and he used the hydrogen to light the school. So he was way ahead of his time. But the costs still nowadays of doing that are very high, partly because electrolysis is very inefficient. There's a lot of energy loss. And then to convert the hydrogen back into electricity needs fuel cells, which are also very expensive at present. And to store it and transport the hydrogen is also very expensive. So although it is a possibility for the future, it doesn't look like near future. It may be better to use other forms of hydrogen in different chemical forms like ammonia. It may be a more suitable fuel to produce from renewable energy. Anyway, thanks for your interest.
Okay, thank you, Mark.